Me with the bell, that's a bit dangerous. Thanks very much, Andrew, for the welcome. I wanted to acknowledge country as Arnie Maxine did in her characteristically warm and welcoming way a moment ago. Thank you, Arnie, for sharing culture with us and for acknowledging this part of Australia. To Andrew, thank you for the introduction to the Commonwealth Bank. But also to Alan's and Richard, thank you for supporting the event. To Melinda and her team, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you all today here at the Sydney Cricket Ground. I always wanted to play here and this might be the closest that I get. And thanks to all of you for coming here for this conversation about the budget. For as long as I can remember, CEDA has been an indispensable part of the national economic policy landscape. And from a personal point of view, I've really appreciated all of the times that CEDA has given me a platform in opposition and now in government in regional Queensland and around Australia to explain our policies and our points of view to an informed and engaged audience like this one. Last time I spoke with you in Brisbane about the productivity challenge, but also our efforts to reform the Productivity Commission and how we turn headwinds into tailwinds in the pursuit of a stronger economy. This time I want to talk with you about our progress to here and our plans from here. And there couldn't be a better time to do it. Today marks precisely 2 months until Katie Gallagher and I hand down the government's third budget on the 14th of May. And that budget will be handed down 1 week shy of our 2-year anniversary as a government. So it's the perfect opportunity to give you a sense of our thinking as we finalise the remaining key decisions and tie them all together. We've got about 7 weeks to do this before the printers start to get nervous. So the familiar rhythms of budget time are now gathering pace. My main job today is to give you an insight into the pressures and priorities that we are grappling with. I want to leave you with a sense of how our economic strategy will change a little, but not a lot, as we fight inflation and build our defences against global uncertainty and adapt to slowing growth in our economy all at the same time. Our overarching objectives are clear, consistent and continuing: to modernise our economy and maximise our opportunities to benefit Middle Australia, to ensure our people and industries are the major beneficiaries of the big changes underway in our society and in our economy, and to deliver the best possible combination of near-term relief, necessary repair and longer-term reform. Now, to understand how we're going about this, it helps to go back to the beginning of the parliamentary term. I think it's too easily forgotten that when we came to office, there were huge deficits as far as the eye could see. There was more than $1 trillion in debt and a big and ballooning interest bill. There was high real spending growth, expiring cost of living help, unavoidable spending pressures which hadn't been budgeted for, inflation which was already galloping, wages which had been stagnant for the best part of a decade, real wages which were falling sharply, and interest rates which had already started rising. Now, this was our inheritance and this was our challenge. The good news is that we also inherited something else: the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Kennedy. And I wanted to thank Stephen and pay tribute to him and pay tribute to my predecessor, my Liberal predecessor, for appointing someone of Stephen's calibre who has served both sides of politics with diligence and distinction. Now, you're probably wondering why at this point I've raised Stephen so specifically. And really there's 2 reasons for that. First of all, because I'm really pleased to let you know that I've asked the Prime Minister to recommend to the Governor-General that Stephen be reappointed for another 5 years when his current term expires in September. Now, this is the Prime Minister's call. He recommends departmental secretary appointments to the Governor-General, and I'm really grateful that he sought my view and agreed to get the ball rolling on this very important reappointment. I really enjoy working with Stephen. Thank you. I really enjoy working with Stephen. Ours is a very effective partnership, and that's because he represents the very best traditions of the Treasury as an institution and the Australian public service more broadly. And I look forward to the opportunity to work with him for longer. That's assuming that he wants to. Actually, I'm pleased to say that he does. We want to provide some certainty and we want to provide some stability here. We've got a lot of important work on the go, as you know, so we are starting the process now. And now I wanted to also say that this is not the most important news that Stephen has had in the past week. I wanted to congratulate his daughter Amelia and her partner Nick on the safe arrival of little Poppy Jean on Saturday, which makes Stephen a grandpa for the first time. Two very auspicious titles, Pop and Secretary. The second reason I wanted to start with Stephen and his reappointment is because I wanted to take you back and to give you a sense of the meeting that we had together in my kitchen in Logan City the day after the last election. Now, obviously it wasn't the first time we've met. We've known and worked with each other for almost 2 decades now. And he got a little glimpse of his future grandparenting responsibilities that day, because when he arrived, I was cleaning these big arcs of purple crayon off the white walls of our living room, which was some welcoming art courtesy of my youngest son, Jack. But Stephen brought with him on that day these big swathes of briefing. And it was exciting after a long campaign and all of those years in opposition to be getting amongst the real work of governing, not even a full day since the polls closed. But there was trepidation as well. We knew things were not going to be easy. And thinking back now and recalling and reliving that discussion for you today, it's quite remarkable how much progress has been made on the main issues that we talked about that day, while I mainlined black coffee after only a few hours sleep and him black tea. We talked about flat incomes and how we'd try and get them growing again. We talked about weak productivity and how we'd try and turn that around. We talked about markets and whether we could make them more effective. We talked about institutions and how we'd renew and refocus them to better inform our work. And we talked at great length on that day about the budget position and how we could repair it. Now, I haven't said this bit publicly before, but it was back then that we first talked about shooting for a surplus in our first term in office. And we thought with some genuine restraint and some proper responsibility that we could get there. To help in the fight against inflation, to rebuild our fiscal buffers if the global economy turned down, to establish then cement our fiscal credentials, we thought that this surplus would be imperative. And don't forget, when we were having this discussion, the deficit was $78 billion. For the year after, it was $57 billion, and there were big deficits every year after that. So what seemed perhaps a little presumptuous at the time has now turned out to be prescient. We knew then that if we saw an opportunity to get the budget back into the black at some stage in our first 3 years, that we would go for it. And that's why, instead of only banking around 40% of the revenue upgrades like our predecessors averaged, we banked 88% across those first 2 budgets. Instead of average real spending growth of 4.1% in the years prior to the election, we got it down to 0.8%. After no savings in the March 2022 budget before the election, we found $50 billion in savings in our first 3 budget updates. Our efforts on the bottom line were perhaps the most notable way that first kitchen chat was formative, but it wasn't the only way. So much of the progress we've made can be traced back to those areas that we identified in opposition and discussed with Stephen the day before the new government was even sworn in. Getting incomes growing again as inflation comes down by backing increases to the minimum wage, pay rises in the aged care sector and new laws to support secure jobs and better pay so that people can earn more and keep more of what they earn. Rolling out billions of dollars in cost of living relief across rent assistance, energy rebates, cheaper medicines, income support, Medicare bulk billing incentives and more. Investing in the drivers of productivity growth, including renewable energy, digital adoption, a more effective care economy and a bigger, better skills base. Putting in place the foundations of more effective markets with a sustainable finance agenda to get capital flowing, a more efficient payment system that Andrew referenced, and reforms to the stock exchange, and competition policy to make our economy more dynamic as well. reforming and rejuvenating our key economic institutions like the Reserve Bank and the Productivity Commission, appointing more women to senior roles, and better informing and centring the national economic debate with a wellbeing framework, the intergenerational report, and the white paper on jobs and opportunities. Now, because of our efforts across two budgets and across all of those policy areas that I've just galloped through, we've made some really important progress in the economy and in the budget. Instead of a deficit of $78 billion in our first year, we delivered a $22 billion surplus. That is the biggest nominal turnaround in the budget in our history. Instead of a $57 billion deficit in our second year, the deficit is $1 billion, so a second surplus is within reach. Instead of gross debt peaking at 45% of our economy, it will peak closer to 35%. This will reduce about $450 billion in debt at the end of the medium term and save about $145 billion in interest costs. Our budget turnaround has been world-leading. It's a bigger improvement in the budget balance than anyone else in the G20, comparing the year before we were elected to the year after. And in the economy too, progress has been welcome and encouraging. Quarterly inflation is now around a third of the 2.1% we inherited. Monthly inflation is almost half the 6.1% we saw in May of 2022. And the ABS has made it very clear that our policies are helping to get inflation down. In the year to December, we directly reduced inflation by half a percentage point on their estimation because of how we designed our cost of living help. And our inflation-fighting efforts, especially our spending restraint, have been recognised by the IMF, the OECD and major ratings agencies as well. Instead of stagnant wages growth, it's now almost double the average that we saw under our predecessors. Instead of real wages going backwards by 3.4% around election time, they're now growing for the first time in nearly 3 years, and this is ahead of schedule. Instead of productivity going backwards by 2.8%, we've seen now a couple of welcome quarters of productivity growth. And average unemployment under our government is at 3.6% compared to 5.6% under our predecessors. And at 4.1% now, it is still lower than it was immediately prior to the pandemic. All of this puts us in good stead for the challenges ahead. So does the ongoing strength of the American economy. So does the fact that last year's concerning developments in the banking system were well contained. And so does the moderation in inflation we're seeing around the world, even though, as the American number told us in the last 24 hours or so, it has been zigging and zagging on the way down. So these are decent foundations, but we know that the global economy is full of downside risk. We know that people are under pressure. We know that we can't yet ring the bell in the fight against inflation. And we know our economy is slowing, in fact, quite substantially, as a consequence of higher interest rates. We are confident, but we're not complacent. We are optimistic, but we are realistic about the year ahead in our economy and the decade beyond. The three biggest drivers of our thinking about this third budget are global uncertainty, persistent cost of living pressures, and slowing growth. And today my main job is to explain to you what that means for our budget strategy. Because these pressures necessitate an approach to the third budget which is a little bit different, but not a lot different, to the first two. And if we start with the similarities because they are the simplest. There will still be a premium in this budget on what's responsible and affordable and meaningful and methodical. There will still be a primary focus, but perhaps not a sole focus, on inflation. There'll be revenue upgrades, and we will bank what we can from them. We are still shooting for that second surplus. But I think you might be more interested today in what will change when it comes to our approach. And I wanted to give you 5 examples of what is a little bit different around this budget compared to the first two. Now, first of all, the revenue upgrades, as you read in the news today, will be smaller. In each of our first two budgets, we benefited from more than $100 billion in revenue upgrades. And this year, we won't see anything like that. In fact, we're even looking at much less than the $69 billion we booked in the last mid-year budget update. Now, there are important reasons for this. For example, the price of iron ore has been falling. In the last week alone, it has fallen by almost 10% because of concerns about the demand for steel in China. And its current price is around 20% lower than it was this far out from last year's budget. When I last looked on Tuesday morning, it was trading at less than $94 a tonne. Thermal coal has been more or less tracking along the path Treasury assumed in December, no better or worse, but its current price is about a third lower than it was this time last year. While the labour market has been quite resilient, it's now softening. So we won't get those very substantial revenue upgrades that we've been accustomed to from outperforming expectations in the labour market. At the end of last year, there were 14.2 million Australians in work. This is around 500,000 more than Treasury was forecasting at the time of the last election. Now, obviously, that's a good thing, but we don't expect to get that kind of upside surprise to our forecast this time around. So smaller revenue upgrades is the first difference. The second is that means banking a substantial amount of the upward revision, but not all of it. In all likelihood, not banking as much as we did in the first two budgets. In our first two budgets, we banked 92% and 82% of upgrades, respectively. Twice, our predecessors banked none of these upgrades, even when one of them was bigger than we're expecting this time around. So we are still committed to banking as much as we can. And the average amount that we will bank since coming to government will still be much higher than it has been in recent history, because we still want to be more responsible and we still want to demonstrate more restraint. The third different element in this budget is that we've already announced more than the usual amount of initiatives ahead of time, and for good reason. A big increase in defence spending, responding to the Defence Strategic Review. Paying the super guarantee on paid parental leave as part of Katie's gender equality strategy. Substantial investments in remote housing as part of closing the gap. The next steps in our Southeast Asian economic strategy, timed for announcement at ASEAN in Melbourne. Reducing compliance costs for business by abolishing almost 500 nuisance tariffs. And perhaps most substantial of all, our cost of living tax cuts announced in January to give us time to legislate them and bed them down as soon as we could. Now, even apart from the $107 billion in tax cuts, there are already billions of dollars of budget initiatives out there already. And this is much more than usual. These are the sorts of things you'd usually hear about on budget night. I'm proud of each of these initiatives. I'm pleased they are already out there, but it means more in the lead up to budget and perhaps a bit less on budget night. And it also means that we have to find room in this budget in May for all of these investments as we seek to land that second surplus. The fourth related point I wanted to make is that there will likely be additional cost of living help in the budget, but it won't be anywhere near the magnitude of those tax cuts. We are already providing a tax cut to every taxpayer and a bigger tax cut to more workers. We need to be upfront and say that any additional help will only be a fraction of that. Any extra help will be targeted, responsible and affordable. There will not be big cash splashes in the budget. It's as simple as that. We believe budgets should be shaped by the economic cycle and not by the electoral cycle. We don't see cost of living help as stimulus, at least not in the way that we thought of it in the GFC or during the pandemic. We see cost of living help as a way of taking the pressure off inflation, not adding to it. Anything that's too costly, too splashy, risks undoing the good progress that we have made together on inflation. And that brings me to the fifth point I wanted to make today about the budget. When we say that there will be a bigger emphasis on growth in this budget, we mean it. But we also mean sustainable growth. Think of it as protein, not just carbs. By this I mean a bigger emphasis on the foundations of growth and the drivers of growth. That's what the budget will be all about. It will be all about a future made in Australia, the energy transformation, a human capital base capable of adapting and adopting technology and catching up and keeping up with changing workplace needs. A bigger emphasis on women and wages and workers, particularly in the care economy. And perhaps most of all, a big new focus on investment. Now, we're pleased that business investment grew every quarter of our government after it fell around 2/3 of the time under our predecessors. It grew 8.3% last year. It was a big driver of what growth we did see in 2023. And we remain a very attractive destination for investment from around the world. But the future is a little less certain and a little less predictable. We can attract investment, you all know that, but we also need to be able to absorb it. If we attract it better and we absorb it better, this will help drive growth in our economy in a world of churn and change. And that's why I'm working with my colleagues on a whole-of-government investment strategy with the budget in mind. And you can expect in that from us a bigger focus on the enablers of that investment, focusing on approvals, access to energy, better trained workforces, more resilient supply chains, and more effective screening of foreign investment. As we work through other ways to invest in emerging industries and the broadening and deepening and modernising of Australia's industrial base. This will require different parts of our government to work better together. It will need a more obvious front door for investors, regardless of whether you first talk to government through Austrade or the National Reconstruction Fund. It will need a more coherent approach to co-investment with industry, including better assistance for priority projects navigating approval processes. And it will need better partnerships with the regions, bringing together the states and businesses and investors around key opportunities for economic development, like we have been starting to do through the Net Zero Authority. Now, I know that we've got limited time here today, and there's some Q&A with Richard in a moment. I'm looking forward to that. So let me just make a few concluding points. You all know, you've all done the maths. You know that being 2 years into a parliamentary term means that there's 1 year to go. And a group like this knows the economics are more important than the politics, which is why I've come to the politics of all of this last. You probably also know, as I do, that the last year of a parliamentary term goes quick. For those of us who prefer governing to campaigning, this is not the most enjoyable thought. But in the last year of a term, the focus inevitably sharpens on what's been achieved and what is to come. In our case, moderating inflation, growing real wages, tax cuts for every taxpayer, and the hard and methodical work we are doing to lay the foundations for growth into the future. There's been progress on the priorities that I've talked about today, but we understand and we acknowledge and we act on the fact that people are under substantial pressure still, and the inflation fight's not yet won. But something else happens in the final year of a term as well, and that's a greater focus on alternatives. That's the good news. The bad news is that there aren't any, at least not yet. Now, I don't want to dwell on this, but my point here is that it's 2 years into the term, and our opponents haven't even begun to do any of the necessary work. They think they can substitute nasty negativity for economic credibility, but the good people of Dunkley have now reminded them that they can't. We, for our part in the government, will stay focused on the main game. We will continue to put good economics before electoral politics. That's what's behind the good progress that we've made in our first 2 years. But again, we know that there is much, much more work to be done. And the third budget will be central to that. And I hope today I've given you a good sense of what that budget will grapple with, what it will look like and why, and what it means for our future together in what I think will be the defining decade. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Treasurer. That was terrific. Really, I think we've all learned a lot from that, and it was really generous of you to share your insights and get us ready for the protein budget as well that's coming.
Why did Ewan laugh in particular when I said that? Protein, not carbs.
There's a few fans of carbs up here. Anyway, dealing with enormous complexity at the moment Andrew touched on some of them: geopolitical instability, global events happening, the urgency of energy transition, the impact of AI, tough economic conditions, as you have reminded us, and coupled with the very easy goal of achieving a soft landing. So there's a lot on your plate, and you've reminded us how difficult the budget process is, which doesn't mean that you're not going to get plenty of free advice. But questions can come from the floor if you'd like to put up your hand. We've also got, you can post your questions through Pigeonhole if you'd like. I'll start off with a couple and then I'll come to those later. Treasurer, you felt like a slightly more sobering tone today. I think there's been a general sense perhaps that things were turning and there was good news ahead, but it sounded like you were reminding people that there's still some challenges. So are you feeling optimistic about achieving soft landing and growth?
Well, I am optimistic about that, and I feel like we've got a lot coming at us, but we've got a lot going for us. And you know, what I tried to do today was to give people an insight into how we grapple with what's coming at us, and how, as we spoke about in Brisbane the last time we spent time together, how we turn those headwinds into tailwinds. And so that's really our focus, not because we think that you know, that the challenges in our economy, global and domestic, are insurmountable, or because you know, we don't recognise the advantages that we have. But my job and Katie's job in our government is to make sure not just that we can make the budget add up, but that it is the best possible combination or calibration of things that we can do now to buffer ourselves against uncertainty, but also to act with confidence and optimism about our opportunities into the future. And there will be a big emphasis in the budget on investment for that reason. You know, people want, as you all know, people want to invest in our country for good reason. We want to make that easier. We want to make, you know, we want to make it possible for people to find the workers they need and the approvals that they need and the stability that they need, so that we can grab the opportunities that are before us.
One of the things you mentioned in your remarks was getting the balance right between cost of living relief, but in a way that doesn't add to inflation. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Yeah,
so as you would expect, you know, cost of living pressures have been the dominant feature of our economy, not just the last couple of years, but a little bit before the election as well, when inflation really started to gallop in that March quarter of 2022. And we spent a lot of time making sure that anything we do when it comes to cost of living help isn't counterproductive. There are lots of ways that you can provide cost of living help which makes the problem worse rather than better, and we are determined to avoid that. And so if you look at some of those big pieces that the ABS has been kind enough to feature in, when they talk about the inflation numbers, the ABS has isolated for us the impact of our cost of living measures. And the three big ones that they often identify: cheaper early childhood education, the energy bill rebates, and the rent assistance. Combined, that took about 0.5 point off the CPI. And that for us is encouraging. It's encouragement that you can design this cost of living help in a way that makes the problem better rather than worse.
And so that is that will be the theme you'll be taking into the budget?
Yeah, I mean, and what I've tried to say, and be upfront again, is the biggest piece by far when it comes to cost of living are the tax cuts. By far, by many multiples. And we are trying to work out a way, is there a meaningful but affordable way that we can do a bit more? I'd like to, if we can find room for that. But when we design that, we will be encouraged and motivated by what we've been able to do to here to get that inflation number down rather than putting upward pressure on it. Because, you know, I don't want the sense that the balance of risk shifting in our economy is not an invitation to go from a sole focus on inflation to a sole focus on growth. Every budget asks us or requires us to strike a series of fine balances, the same as it would around the boardroom tables in your businesses and in your universities. You're always looking to find that balance point that best addresses all of your priorities. And so the budget will be a little bit different, but not a lot of different in that regard. It's not mission accomplished on inflation. We need to be so careful about that. The American number the other night, but in lots of other places where inflation has moderated, it hasn't come down in a straight line. We're very focused on that. and so anything we do will be helpful rather than harmful in that fight.
You mentioned the US then, and also in your remarks, you talked about the strength of the US economy as being something positive, and that's helped. You didn't talk about the China economy. I wonder if you might want to talk a little bit more about how you see the US perhaps going forward, and also China.
Well, the US economy has defied expectations, and not even just the gloomiest expectations. Really, the central case not that long ago was that the American economy would be much weaker, and it has outperformed those expectations. That's a good thing for the global economy, and we've got that going for us. You all know, particularly those of you here in the financial system, you know that when Silicon Valley Bank hit the fence and when Credit Suisse went through its challenges in Europe, there was a lot of, I think, justified concern about the strength of the global banking system. It turned out that those issues have been quite well contained. That's a good thing as well. Inflation coming down around the world is a good thing, but we do have the Chinese economy quite a bit softer. Chinese authorities last week came out and said they expect that softness in the Chinese economy to continue for a bit longer. That is challenging. Obviously the UK is in recession. Japan and other big economies have had particularly weak growth. These are all the sorts of concerning developments in the global economy as well. The US has been a standout. China has been especially concerning, but there's an element of weakness in most of the big economies around the world.
And nothing coming up in the US that causes you concerns?
Nothing we can't deal with.
Bit of controversy this week around the GST and the Commonwealth Grants Commission decision. I wonder if you'd like to weigh in on that.
Well, first of all, it's not unprecedented that the states would like more money. That is a story as old as the Federation. And, you know, I'm very fortunate that I work with a group of, you know, quite good people who are treasurers in the states and territories, very well motivated, very good people, and I enjoy working with them. But I acknowledge and recognise that in a world where everyone's budget is under pressure in one way or another, that the states and territories would like more money, and that they are dealing with their own pressures, which are a bit like some of the pressures that I ran through in the Commonwealth context. I had a good chat with Treasurer Mookie this morning. Again, very good person, very well motivated. Had a good conversation this morning. I spoke with Treasurer Mulligan from South Australia, another good state treasurer. Our interest here is in working with the states rather than against them. When it comes in particular to the issues that Daniel Mookie has been raising about the Commonwealth Grants Commission process, I mean, that process is entirely at arm's length from us. That is an independent process. Every time there's a determination about the distribution of the GST, there are inevitably some states and territories who are happy, some states and territories who are not especially happy, and that's what's happened on this occasion as well. We will always try and do what we can for the people of New South Wales, but also for the state and territory governments to try and help them deal with these pressures that they are under. They need to recognise that our budget is under pressure too, but I believe, and I know the Prime Minister believes, this is his kind of defining instinct, is that we get more done when we work together than when we work at cross purposes. I'll be meeting with the state and territory treasurers tomorrow. We will no doubt be talking about some of these sorts of issues, but we'll do the best we can for them. We recognise the pressures that their budget are under, and we ask them to recognise the pressure that we're under too.
There's usually one state that's pretty happy.
I haven't met that state yet.
That brings up the topic of tax reform. It's difficult, complex, but do you see any realistic possibility that there might be a significant long-term structural tax reform, end-to-end look at our system, the tax base, what would work, what is better?
Well, the way we've gone about that, we recognise that the tax base is not what it could be. And so the way that we've gone about that is, instead of having some kind of big bang review, we've tried to identify the areas where we can make some progress this parliamentary term. Changes to the PRRT, changes to high balance superannuation, big multinational tax reform agenda. We've got the personal income tax cuts, we've cut taxes on EVs, we've cut taxes for small business and energy efficiency. We're engaged in a conversation with the states and territories, including tomorrow, about the future of fuel excise. So there is a big agenda on tax, which I don't think is always recognised when people are thinking about and talking about tax in our political system. We've actually got a lot before the Parliament right now. If you made a list of the tax reform efforts over recent times, what we're doing is probably the biggest agenda, certainly for 15 years, maybe for 25 years. And that's because we think we make more progress by identifying where we can do something meaningful, trying to legislate it and bed it down. So that's our focus, rather than on the kind of big bang changes that people have been proposing. And we just find that that's more effective. You know, we are practical, we are pragmatists, and we're trying to get as much done as we can. That requires bringing people along with you and bringing the Parliament along with you, and that's not always the easiest thing to do. And the parallel I would draw here, so that people don't think this is just the way we're going about tax reform, is competition policy as well. We've got this big competition policy review going on right now. It's got a 2-year window, but what we've said to people is, don't expect us to wait to the end of that 2-year period to get a nice glossy bound report, to do a little bit of it and then put the thing on the shelf. We've said if there is progress that can be made at any point in that 2-year period that we're doing all this work on competition policy, then we're interested in doing that. So whether it's non-compete clauses, whether it's mergers and acquisitions, whether it's the work that we announced earlier in the week about tariff reform, the biggest tariff reform in 2 decades, what we try to do is we're trying to reform the economy in an ongoing way, identifying where we can make progress, making progress, and then considering next steps then.
Talking about structural reform, perhaps in the context of the intergenerational report, which talked about productivity growth and talked about a long-term productivity trend of 2% growth for Australia. I think you've already said publicly you think we should be aiming higher for that.
Yeah.
But what are the sort of things we need to do to be able to get that number higher?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted that people are focused on the intergenerational report and the projections in there. And what we tried to do is we tried to say, yes, the intergenerational report is about pressures on the budget as our society ages, but it's also about these other big shifts in our economy and in our society, from hydrocarbons to renewables, from IT to AI, from globalisation to fragmentation. I want people engaged in these sorts of questions, and part of that is working out, are we okay with 40 years of weaker growth or 40 years of weak productivity growth? And I'm not. I hope you're not. I don't think you are. And so this focus on the IGR is really welcome. And I think the answer to our productivity challenge, and I foreshadowed this when we hung out in Brisbane, is I think we need a much broader conception of the drivers of productivity growth. Now, people have a view about industrial relations. I don't dismiss those views. But that's not the only show in town when it comes to productivity. What will matter for productivity is whether we are any good at adapting and adopting technology, whether we are any good at getting our human capital base right so that people can keep up with change and prosper, be beneficiaries of change rather than victims of change, and whether we get the energy transformation right, whether we deliver care more effectively, whether we harness data and digital in a much more effective way. I think these are the things that will determine whether we get the productivity growth we need to lift living standards and whether we do better on economic growth and economic progress than the central case at the moment in the IGR.
You talked about digital in there. AI, everybody has a view and is talking about. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about not just what AI might do for the economy, but I'd be interested in actually how you and your department, are you using it? Is it helping you? Are you finding it?
Are you asking me if my speech was written by...
Well, I didn't want to say, but...
We're getting our head around it like you all are. And we're very fortunate in this regard. We've got terrific colleagues like Ed Husick and others who are doing a heap of work in this area on behalf of the government. But I think your question is, is appreciated, because it recognises that AI doesn't sit in this little kind of portfolio silo, like a lot of things, but it doesn't. And in your businesses too, I don't think anyone here now thinks AI is a kind of a quirky little unit on the, out the back of the 5th floor of your office building. You are working out how you make it central. We're doing that when it comes to government services, when it comes to economic growth, when it comes to how we think about and measure and progress on the productivity front. But thankfully, Ed is doing a lot of work for us, and we're all engaged in that in one way or another.
Sticking with tech, one of the questions that came through from the audience, Matt Coman perhaps sparked a bit of discussion earlier this week when he was talking about some of the big tech companies and the revenues they earn and maybe the tax they pay. You talked about multinational tax reform.
Yeah.
Do you see a case for some of those multinationals paying more?
Oh, I certainly do. I think the way that is done is still up for grabs. We've got this big international agenda that the OECD has been leading to their credit around multinational taxation, and Australia, under governments of both political persuasions, and again I tip my lid to Josh and the former government for being enthusiastic about it as well. It shouldn't be partisan when it comes to reforming the multinational tax system, and it hasn't been, and that's a good thing, largely. We are trying to advance that agenda, but we need to recognise that one of the parts of that agenda which has stalled is the part that relates to the tech companies. And I think Matt was reflecting that in his, I think, welcome contribution earlier in the week. And we're all trying to work out how can we make the multinational tax regime more effective, how can we make the tax base more sustainable, and where do the tech companies fit in that, and whether that is a kind of a perfect multilateral solution or whether countries are going to have to do more of the heavy lifting at home. I think that is still something that we're working through.
I'll check with the audience in a tick if there's any questions, but otherwise we'll get the mic over now.
Jim, thanks for the address. Adrian Piani from GHD. We work in the infrastructure sector, proudly Australian. So I've got a question on infrastructure, because you have gone to productivity and sort of reform and setting up the basics for the economy, and I think infrastructure is a big part of that, but you didn't really talk to it in your presentation. So probably two questions. What's your general view of the infrastructure pipeline and the money to be invested over the longer term, noting that you did have a bit of a rebalance last year or a relook? And secondly, your ideas on productivity, because it is a sector that could benefit from productivity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. What we try to do with the infrastructure pipeline is make it realistic and make it deliverable. We didn't make it smaller. You would know, and others would know, that we've got this $120 billion infrastructure pipeline over the next 10 years, and we didn't diminish that by a single cent. And it's entirely possible that over time the pipeline will get bigger than 120 over 10 years. But we didn't hack into it. We just made sure that the projects were deliverable and affordable within that. We've all got an interest in value for money when it comes to the infrastructure build. And part of that is making the sector more productive. And again, big role for technology, big role for human capital, and energy, and all of the other things that we've talked about in the context of productivity more broadly.
Last week before was the ASEAN conference, which you were at. I wonder whether you could give us a bit of an insight into what some of our regional counterparts are worried about, and whether they're thinking about some of these issues in the same way that you are.
Oh, I think so. I mean, everyone understands and appreciates that the geopolitics of the region are tricky, and that we all have an interest in broadening and deepening our economic ties in that context. I think there was a unanimity on that front. Unanimity is not a common feature of foreign policy, but I think in the sense that we can all do much more to invest more deeply in each other's success. I think there was a lot of common ground. And that's especially important in a world that is fragmenting. You know, there is many of you, as I have, been around long enough to see the kind of the way that the globalisation has kind of waxed and waned over the years and over the decades. And there is an element of fragmentation now. It's one of the key trends that we identified in the intergenerational report for good reason. And for a country like us, you know, reliable, magnificent resource base, wonderful human capital base, trusted partner in the region, you know, wonderful institutions and decision making. This makes us more attractive. In a more fragmented world, we are more attractive rather than less. And we don't want to see this uncertainty. We want the status quo in our region. We want peace and prosperity and stability and security. But in a world that is where people are rethinking their supply chains, we've got a big chance to be a much more prominent part of the way that people think about supply chains which are more robust and more reliable.
Those threats to global trade and globalisation they're existential threats for our prosperity.
Yeah, if you made a list of the countries that have got the most to gain from, you know, robust trading relationships and supply chains, you know, we'd be at or near the top of that list. You know, relatively big economy in the most dynamic part of the world. All of this opportunity laid out before us, and we would be among the biggest losers of a change to the status quo in the region. And so, you know, that's why, I mean, I salute, you know, Penny Wong and Don Farrell and Richard Marles and the Prime Minister for the way that they've engaged with the region. But one of the reasons why the whole Cabinet is engaged with the region is because we recognise that point, that we've got a lot to gain and a lot to lose. And that's why ASEAN was just this perfectly timed, perfect opportunity. Because ASEAN is where the action is. We want to get a bigger slice of that action for all of you and for the country. And we bring to the table a lot of advantages in that regard.
One of the questions from the floor was around the cost of energy and renewable energy. Is there, in particular, are you thinking about that as an issue as well, and relief? Not just the questions raising, not just at the individual level, but also at the business level.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, you know, we've talked about where does the growth come from? Where does the productivity growth come from? What are our opportunities in the defining decade? I mean, energy, so much of what we want to achieve together relies on cheaper, cleaner, more reliable, increasingly renewable energy. And so there'll be a big focus in the budget on energy, as there has been in the first couple of budgets as well. And again, and you know, this debate, if you want to call it that, about nuclear energy is kind of welcome in a way, because it's focusing the national mind on what our genuine opportunities are here, not what our fake opportunities are here, but where the real opportunity lies. And renewable energy for Australia is by far the cheapest source of new energy. Every investor knows that. And so you can expect that to be a bigger and bigger part of our agenda, including in the May budget.
Do you think we're making enough progress on the transition?
Oh, I think there are concerning elements. I think we are confident that we will hit our targets, but we're certainly not complacent about that. You know, some of you were at a speech I gave towards the end of last year, working closely with Chris Bowen to put it together, really about the risks to us hitting our targets. And some of the policy that has been announced since that speech before now, whether it's the work that Chris Bowen's been doing with the states very effectively, but in other areas as well, has recognised that we need to keep the effort up in order to hit those targets, in order to source and transmit that cleaner and cheaper energy that you all need.
Question up the back, if I might get the mic out there. While we're doing that, you mentioned the electoral cycle. 4-year terms?
Sign me up. You know,
Done. We've achieved something today. Excellent.
And it's just the perfect opportunity for me to recognise a couple of people in the audience who I didn't realise were going to be here today. But Sally Situ, the member for Reid, is here, and Jerome Laxale, the member for Bennelong. Don't tell anyone. Two of my favourite colleagues. have come along to lunch today. I should have acknowledged them at the start, but I can see them now from this different perspective, and I'm sure they're up for 4-year terms as well.
Thank you.
Hello. So Peter Hannam from The Guardian. I've got a short-term and a long-term question. The short-term one, with the coming budget, do you see there's much need for extra cost of living relief, given we've got inflation falling, real wages finally rising, the RBA nearing a move which might be downward? So is there much need for extra cost of living support? Much of the 20 billion still to be spent, if I'm not mistaken, of the existing cost of living relief. And secondly, you said you wanted to get beyond the electoral cycle, and I think you mentioned wonderful decision making. And I'm wondering, like before the election, is there the possibility to hold a serious debate that would look at the real issues facing the structural deficit and how to address that in the economy, so that you can go to the election, if you like, with a mandate, rather than, I guess, trying to fix things afterwards? Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for all of the ways that you engage with these really serious questions in your writing. On your first question, people are still under the pump. We recognise that. We've seen inflation come off in welcome and encouraging ways, but we know that people are still under pressure, and that's why the tax cuts are so important, and that's why they will be, no matter what we decide over the course of the next 5 or 6 weeks, the tax cuts will be the most substantial cost of living help in the budget. But there is a case for some more targeted help if we can afford to do it, and we will work through that in the course of the coming weeks. That, as I said in my prepared remarks and have alluded to a couple of times in the Q&A, don't expect that to be anything like the $107 billion that we're spending on the tax cuts. But there might be an opportunity to do something more targeted, more akin to the sorts of things that we did before we made the change on tax. On your second question, and this is something I think about a lot, as you would expect me to, the structural position of the budget. We are really pleased with the progress that we've made in the near term on the budget, the first surplus in 15 years. I can see a second surplus from here, but we're not there yet. That is really good because we save on one of the 5 biggest structural pressures on the budget, which is the interest we pay on the already existing debt. Because you follow it closely, and hopefully others in the room understand that our big pressures in a structural sense are the interest we pay on debt, aged care, NDIS, healthcare, and defence. And so we are very focused on how do we make sure that we can deliver those things. How can we get the interest bill down, which is part of the rationale for the near-term budget repair, but how can we address those other issues as well? You're familiar with what we are trying to do on the NDIS, which is important, and you would have seen that my wonderful colleague Annika Wells put out the Aged Care Task Force report as well, which goes to some of these questions. Long way of saying, yes, we think there is an opportunity for a proper national conversation about structural pressures on the budget, but we're not waiting for that. We're making progress on the NDIS, we're making progress on interest. We've had a lot to say about and commitments to make in defence. We've invested billions of dollars in Medicare, and we've got a piece of work still to do on aged care, following the release of that really important piece of work that Annika put out a few days ago.
Thanks, Treasurer. I think I'm going to finish up with one last question. We've covered a lot of territory today, a lot of complexity, and a lot of things a lot of challenges in front of us. But you talked about being optimistic, so I just wonder whether you could just wrap up by reminding us of why you're optimistic and why we should all also share in your optimism.
Well, I think there is so much that we can be proud of. I don't mean as a government, I mean as a country. We have seen inflation come off, really quite substantially. We do have real wages growth again. We do have unemployment, which in historical terms would be seen as incredibly low. We do have people who are engaged with our economic challenges. We are in the dynamic part of the world. We have so much going for us. But I really genuinely feel like in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time, people will look back on the 2020s and that will be the period that they focus on which determines whether we subsequently succeed or fail. And I like to recognise all of the things that we have going for us, but I also like to be upfront about the things that are coming at us. Global uncertainty, we're not there yet on inflation. Our economy is slowing in ways that we do expect, but that doesn't make it any easier. And so we've got a lot of work to do together. And what we like to do, and the reason why we give these kinds of we do these kinds of events a couple of months out from the budget, is because we want to involve you in what we're grappling with. We want you to understand that not all of these decisions, we don't pretend that they're kind of black and white decisions that sitting around the cabinet table grappling with all this sort of stuff, that there are obvious answers. There's always shades of grey, and there's always fine balances to be struck. But the reason I appreciate so many of you, and the reason I appreciate this opportunity today, is because from Prime Minister Albanese right through our cabinet and right through our team, Sally and Jerome, everyone, we recognise that we don't have all of the answers ourselves. We give ourselves a better chance of succeeding if we involve you in the conversation. And that, I hope, is what you take away from today, as well as some of the hints and tips I've given you about the budget in 2 months' time.
Please join me in thanking the Treasurer.